History is not just written in ink. Sometimes it is carved into flesh. Across centuries and civilizations, humans created torture methods so brutal, so ingenious, and so terrifying that even today they send chills down the spine. In this video, we dive deep into 25 of the most horrific torture methods ever used in human history. Guys, can you help me to hit 1,000 subscribers on this channel? And it's my dream, it's humble request. Let's start the video with number 25. 25. Flaying alive. Flaying, removing a person's skin while they were still alive, has been practiced in several civilizations, with the earliest detailed records coming from the Neo-Assyrian Empire around the 9th century BCE. Assyrian kings like Ashurnasirpal II documented flaying rebels and displaying their skins on city walls as warnings. The process involved tying the victim to a pole or wall, then using a sharp blade to peel away sections of skin starting from the limbs or torso. Skilled executioners avoided major blood vessels to prolong life. Victims usually died from shock, blood loss, or infection within hours. Persian kings, such as Cambyses II, reportedly ordered corrupt officials flayed, using their skin to upholster chairs or hang in courts as a symbol of justice. Medieval Europe also used flaying in rare cases, particularly for treason or the murder of nobles. The method had a strong psychological component. The slow, methodical removal of the skin served as both torture and terror. The victim often remained conscious for much of the process, making flaying one of the most agonizing punishments ever devised. By the 17th century, most regions abolished it, but historical accounts keep its reputation alive as an example of extreme cruelty. 24. The blood eagle. The blood eagle is a legendary Norse execution method described in medieval sagas. Though historians debate whether it was actually practiced or exaggerated, according to the sagas, Vikings from the 8th to 11th century used this ritual on enemies, oath-breakers, and traitors. The execution began with the victim tied face down. The executioner then sliced open the back and separated the ribs from the spine. The lungs were pulled outward through the openings, arranged to resemble wings, symbolizing an eagle. Salt was added to maximize pain and prevent rapid death. The ritual was meant as a brutal symbolic offering to Odin, the god of war, with the victim's suffering believed to honor the gods. The most famous story involves Ivar, the Boneless, who allegedly performed the blood eagle on King Gla of Northumbria. Some scholars argue it was more poetic metaphor than historical fact, while others believe it may have been performed rarely under extreme circumstances. Whether myth or reality, the blood eagle remains one of the most horrifying descriptions of ancient execution, combining religious ritual, symbolic vengeance, and unimaginable physical pain. 23. Rat torture. Rat torture has been used in various cultures, but it became most documented in ancient Rome and later in medieval Europe and colonial South America. The method weaponized the natural instincts of rats, especially their desperation to escape enclosed spaces. One of the most infamous versions involved placing a metal container filled with rats onto the victim's stomach or chest. The container was then heated from the top or sides. As the rats panicked from the rising temperature, they sought escape usually by digging into the victim's flesh. In some variations, the rats ate their way through muscle tissue and organs, causing immense pain and usually a slow, fatal infection. Roman interrogators used it against rebels and spies, while medieval captors used rats in dungeons where they bred in large numbers. During colonial rule in South America, certain rebel punishments involved tying victims in pits, where rats and rodents would slowly devour the lower body. What made rat torture especially terrifying was its unpredictability. Unlike mechanical devices, animals responded instinctively, creating an uncontrollable primal form of agony that intensified fear long before the torture began. 22. The tying of the 5 horses, also known as 5-horse dismemberment. This method was practiced in China from the Qin dynasty 3rd century BCE through the Yuan dynasty 14th century CE. It was used for the most severe crime sprees in rebellion and attempts on the emperor's life. The victim's limbs were tied to 5 horses, one for each arm and leg, and a 5th tied to the head or torso. When the executioner signaled, the horses were whipped in different directions. The immense force tore the body apart, ripping limbs from sockets and splitting the torso. Sometimes the horses were made to pull gradually, prolonging suffering instead of instantly tearing the body. In other cases, the execution was swift but highly ceremonial, performed before crowds as a warning. One of the most famous executions was that of Fang La, a rebel leader in the Song dynasty who was punished using this method. 5-horse dismemberment showcased the power of the state. Just as the rack stretched the body, this method tore it apart completely, symbolizing total destruction of the emperor's enemies. It was abolished during later dynasties as legal reforms modernized China's justice system. 21. Burial alive. Burial alive has appeared in many cultures, often connected to ritual punishment, religious violations, or accusations of infidelity. In ancient Rome, Vestal virgins who broke their vow of chastity were famously condemned to be buried alive in underground chambers with a small supply of food and water, symbolizing both execution and avoidance of blood guilt. In India, certain ancient texts describe burying criminals in pits as a form of karmic retribution. Meanwhile, in China, burial alive was sometimes used during dynastic conflicts or mass punishments ordered by emperors. Medieval Europe used the method for women accused of adultery or infanticide. Victims were placed in wooden coffins and lowered into the ground or buried directly in pits. Death came through suffocation, dehydration, or panic-induced cardiac arrest. Burial alive was also used in wartime massacres and by tyrants who wanted to eliminate enemies secretly without public spectacle. Of all torture methods, burial alive is particularly terrifying because it exploits psychological horror rather than direct physical mutilation. The darkness, confinement, and slow progression towards suffocation make it one of the most mentally devastating forms of execution ever practiced. 20. Necklacing. Necklacing emerged in South Africa during the 1980s, particularly during the final years of apartheid. Unlike ancient torture methods, this is a modern form of execution fueled by political conflict and mob justice. The method involved placing a rubber tire around the victim's chest and arms, trapping the arms tightly against the body. The tire was then filled with gasoline and set on fire. When ignited, the tire melted onto the skin while the flames consumed the body. Victims often remained conscious for several agonizing minutes as burning rubber stuck to the flesh. Necklacing became a symbolic punishment for alleged traitors, informants, or collaborators with the apartheid government. The practice spread through townships and resistance movements, though many anti-apartheid leaders, including Nelson Mandela, publicly condemned it. Because it required no special equipment and could be carried out by crowds, necklacing became one of the most brutal examples of mob torture in modern history. It represents the devastating consequences of political instability, fear, and collective rage. 19. The bamboo torture. Bamboo torture is believed to have been used in parts of East and Southeast Asia, though popular accounts often exaggerate it. The method relies on bamboo's natural ability to grow rapidly up to several inches per day. The victim was tied down over young bamboo shoots planted beneath them. As the bamboo grew, its sharp tips slowly pierced the skin and continued to grow upward through the body. While modern experiments suggest bamboo can indeed grow through soft tissue, historical documentation is limited. Some accounts attribute its use to Japanese forces during World War II, while others claim earlier use in Southeast Asian kingdoms. Whether or not the exact practice was common, the concept itself reflects the use of nature as a tool of prolonged torture. The process took days, causing infection, internal bleeding, and increasing agony as the bamboo stalk thickened. Even if partly mythologized, bamboo torture symbolizes a slow, inescapable death, powered by nature's relentless force-making it one of the most haunting ideas in torture lore. 18. Crucifixion. Crucifixion originated with the Persians around the 6th century BCE, later adopted by the Carthaginians and perfected by the Romans, who made it one of the most excruciating and humiliating forms of execution. The victim was nailed or tied to a wooden crossbeam, an upright post. Contrary to artistic depictions, nails were usually driven through the wrists, not the palms, to support body weight. The feet were nailed or tied to the base. Death came slowly over hours, or days through suffocation, dehydration, and shock. As the body sagged, the victims struggled to breathe, forcing themselves upward on nailed feet to gasp for air. Romans used crucifixion for slaves, rebels, and criminals. The most famous victim in history is Jesus of Nazareth, whose crucifixion under Roman rule became a defining event in Christianity. Crucifixion served not only as execution, but as psychological warfare. Bodies were displayed publicly, often along roads, to warn others against rebellion. The Roman Empire abolished crucifixion in the 4th century CE under Emperor Constantine, but its legacy remains one of the most recognized and agonizing torture methods in world history. 17. Scold's bridle. The scold's bridle, also called the brank, was invented in Scotland in the 16th century and later spread through England and Germany. It was used primarily to punish women accused of gossiping, nagging, or speaking against authority, a reflection of deeply misogynistic laws. The device consisted of a metal cage that enclosed the head. A built-in gag plate or spike was inserted into the mouth, pressing down on the tongue to prevent speech. Some versions had multiple spikes that caused bleeding whenever the victim tried to talk. Women were sometimes paraded through town while wearing the bridle, exposing them to public humiliation and ridicule. Physical pain combined with social shaming made the punishment both mental and emotional torture. Records show that the scold's bridle was used in both judicial sentences and community-level punishments. In extreme cases, prolonged work caused severe cuts, infections, and lasting trauma. By the late 18th century, reforms in European law led to its decline. Today, surviving bridles in museums serve as stark reminders of how torture was often tied to controlling speech, especially women's voices. 16. The collar of spikes. Spiked collars have been used in different cultures, including medieval, Ethiopia, North Africa, and parts of Europe. These metal or wooden collars were lined with inward-facing spikes that pressed into the neck, chin, and shoulders. When placed on the victim, the collar prevented movement. Any attempt to lower the head, turn, or rest caused the spikes to pierce deeper into the skin. Some collars were locked in place for days, causing infections and deep wounds. In Europe, similar devices were used for prisoners and religious offenders. In parts of Africa, they appeared in royal justice systems as punishments for betrayal or theft. The collar served as a form of prolonged restraint rather than immediate execution. The constant pain, sleep deprivation, and difficulty eating or drinking caused severe exhaustion. While less famous than devices like the rack or Iron Maiden, the spiked collar remains an example of medieval ingenuity in inflicting continuous, unavoidable suffering over long periods. 15. The wheelbarrow torture. The wheelbarrow torture, documented in late imperial China from the Ming to Qing dynasties, forced victims to walk long distances while bound to a wooden frame shaped like a wheelbarrow. The device strapped the arms and torso forward, forcing the victim into a stooped, unnatural posture. They were then made to walk for miles while carrying the weight of the wooden frame. Guards beat or whipped the victim whenever they slowed down. The combination of exhaustion, muscle strain, dehydration, and heat exposure often caused collapse. Some prisoners died from fatigue alone. Unlike spectacular execution devices, wheelbarrow torture was a slow, grinding punishment that broke the body over days rather than hours. The psychological toll of endless marching, lack of rest, and constant pain made it one of China's most physically draining forms of punishment. 14. The Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey, also called the wooden horse, appeared in Europe in the late 16th century and became a common punishment during inquisitions, military campaigns, and witch trials. The device consisted of a wooden beam shaped like an inverted V, forming a sharp edge along the top. Victims were forced to sit astride the sharp ridge, with their full body weight pressing down on the groin. To increase suffering, torturers often attached heavy weights to the victim's ankles, pulling the body downward and forcing deeper pressure on the narrow edge. The method caused extreme pain, tearing of muscles, and sometimes permanent damage to the pelvic region. While not always intended to kill, the Spanish donkey was excruciating enough to break even hardened prisoners. Historical records indicate its use by European armies as a punishment for soldiers, while inquisitors applied it to suspected witches or heretics. Some civilians were subjected to it as a public humiliation, with crowds watching the victims struggle to remain balanced. By the 18th century, reforms in European justice systems gradually eliminated the Spanish donkey, but it remains one of the most visually disturbing torture devices in history. 13. From ancient Persia to medieval England and the Holy Roman Empire. One of the earliest documented uses comes from 6th century BCE Persia, where certain crimes, especially poisoning, were punished by immersing offenders in boiling liquids. Methods varied. Some victims were slowly lowered into cauldrons of boiling water, oil, wax, or even molten tar. Others were placed in cold liquid and heated gradually, prolonging the agony as temperatures rose. In medieval Europe, boiling became an official punishment under King Henry VIII, who decreed it the penalty for murder by poisoning. Criminals were executed publicly in giant cauldrons, with crowds gathering to witness the gruesome spectacle. In the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire also used boiling for counterfeiters, reasoning that ruining national currency was a crime deserving extreme punishment. Death from boiling was slow and excruciating, involving severe burns, shock, and organ failure. While eventually abolished across Europe by the 17th century, it left behind a legacy of fear and remains one of history's most brutal forms of execution. 12. The Judas Cradle. The Judas Cradle, sometimes called the Judas Chair, is believed to have originated in Italy during the 16th century, later spreading through Europe during inquisitions and political interrogations. The device consisted of a tall wooden pyramid or cone mounted on a stand. Victims were stripped, bound, and hoisted above the sharp point. They were then slowly lowered so the tip penetrated the anus or vagina. The agony came not only from the penetration, but from the body's weight gradually forcing the victim deeper onto the point. Interrogators controlled how quickly or slowly the descent occurred, often raising the person and lowering them repeatedly to prolong suffering. Infection was almost guaranteed, as the device was rarely cleaned. Victims were sometimes forced to sit for hours or even days, their muscles trembling as they tried to avoid sinking deeper. The torture was meant to break willpower, extract confessions, or humiliate political enemies. While some historians debate the frequency of its use given limited surviving, records the Judas cradle remains one of the most psychologically disturbing devices of European punishment. Its design combined fear, humiliation, and excruciating pain, making it a symbol of the darkest aspects of medieval interrogation. 11. The heretic's fork. The heretic's fork was used during the Spanish Inquisition, a period of intense religious policing from the late 15th to 17th century. The device was deceptively simple: a small metal tool with two sets of prongs, one pointing upward and one downward, connected by a narrow rod. The upper prongs were pressed beneath the chin, while the lower set dug into the sternum. Once strapped around the neck, the victim could not lower their head without stabbing themselves. The device prevented sleep, forcing the person to remain awake for days. Any attempt to nod off resulted in sharp punctures that caused bleeding and searing pain. The heretic's fork was mainly used to break mental resistance, especially during interrogations of suspected heretics, witches, or converts accused of insincerity. The torture exploited exhaustion rather than bloodshed. Sleep deprivation alone could cause paranoia, hallucinations, and uncontrollable fear. Victims were often forced to wear the fork publicly, with inscriptions like "I renounce" engraved on the metal. Although not always fatal, its psychological impact was profound. Many prisoners confessed simply to end the torment. The heretic's fork is a chilling example of how simple tools could be weaponized in the name of religious control. 10. Impalement. Impalement is one of the oldest and most brutal execution methods, recorded as early as 18th century BCE in ancient Mesopotamia and later used by Persians, Ottomans, and Eastern European rulers. The most infamous figure associated with it is Vlad III of Wallachia, known as Vlad the Impaler, who used the method extensively in the 15th century. The process involved forcing a long wooden or metal pole through the victim's body, often inserted through the anus or vagina, and emerging through the shoulder, chest, or mouth. Skilled executioners avoided major organs, ensuring the victim stayed alive for hours or even days. The pole was then raised upright for public display. Impalement was as much psychological warfare as punishment. Vlad famously impaled thousands of invading Ottoman soldiers, arranging them in forests of corpses visible for miles. The sight terrified enemies and maintained strict internal control. Although impalement was used across multiple empires, it became synonymous with ruthlessness and terror wherever it appeared. The slow, lingering agony and the public spectacle made it one of history's most horrifying methods of execution dies, not merely to kill, but to send an unforgettable political message. 9. The pear of anguish. The pear of anguish, also known as the choke pear, emerged in 17th century Europe and was allegedly used in France, Italy, and parts of Germany. While some historians question how widespread it truly was, surviving metal devices confirm its existence. The instrument resembled a metal pear with hinged pedals connected to a screw mechanism. When inserted into the mouth, anus, or vagina, the torturer turned the screw to force the pedals outward, stretching the orifice from the inside. This caused severe tearing, bleeding, and sometimes permanent damage. In theory, the mouth version was used to punish liars or blasphemers, while the vaginal and anal versions targeted alleged witches and sexual offenders. Victims were often restrained while the device expanded slowly, maximizing pain. Though not always fatal by itself, the pair of anguish caused massive internal injuries and infections. Contemporary descriptions suggest it was favored for interrogations that demanded immediate suffering without public spectacle. While its precise historical use remains debated, the device endures as a symbol of European cruelty. Its design shows a disturbing level of creativity inflicting pain from within, using a deceptively simple mechanical expansion. 8. Keel hauling. Keel hauling originated as a naval punishment in the Dutch Navy during the 1600s, later adopted by other European fleets. Unlike land-based tortures, this method used the ship itself as the instrument of agony. The condemned sailor was tied with ropes and dragged beneath the ship's hull from one side to the other. The underside of naval vessels was covered with sharp barnacles, splintered wood, and rusted metal. As the victim was pulled underwater, these jagged surfaces shredded skin, tore flesh, and caused deep wounds. Survival depended on how quickly the crew pulled the person across. A fast haul could be survivable, leaving the victim mutilated but alive. A slow haul often meant drowning, unconsciousness, or fatal blood loss. Keel hauling was typically reserved for severe offenses such as desertion, mutiny, or striking an officer. The punishment served as a terrifying example to the rest of the crew, reinforcing discipline at sea. Records show that Dutch naval authorities used the practice officially, while pirates and privateers adopted it as a feared deterrent. By the 18th century, most navies abolished keel hauling due to its brutality, but its reputation remains legendary in maritime history. 7. The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull, also called the Sicilian Bull, is one of the most infamous torture devices in ancient history. It was created in the 6th century BCE by Perillos of Athens, a craftsman who presented it to Phalaris, the tyrant of Agrigentum in Sicily. The device was a hollow bronze statue shaped like a life-sized bull, designed with a door on one side where the victim would be locked inside. A fire was then lit beneath the metal structure, slowly heating the bronze until the person inside was roasted alive. What made the Brazen Bull uniquely horrifying was the acoustics. Perillos designed pipes inside the bull's nostrils that transformed the victim's screams into sounds, resembling a bull's roar. The creator intended this to entertain the ruler, but legend says Phalaris turned the device on Perillos himself, making him its first victim. The Brazen Bull became a symbol of political terror across the Mediterranean, used to punish rebels, traitors, and enemies of tyrants. Even centuries later, historians referenced it as one of humanity's most brutal inventions, combining psychological fear, slow-burning agony, and public spectacle into one chilling execution tool. 6. Linky death by 1,000 cuts. Linky, often called death by 1,000 cuts, was one of China's most feared execution methods, first officially recorded during the Song dynasty in the 10th century CE. It was reserved for severe crimes such as treason, mass murder, and patricide. Rather than a quick beheading, Linke aimed to extend suffering, shame the condemned, and demonstrate imperial power. Executioners were trained to prolong the torture for as long as possible. They used small, precise blades to cut pieces of flesh from the victim's arms, legs, chest, and sometimes even the face. The first cuts were non-fatal and deliberately placed to avoid major arteries. The goal was to keep the person alive, sometimes for hours, while gradually dismembering them. In some dynasties, the condemned were given opium to remain conscious but unable to resist. By the final stage, vital organs were removed, or the victim was simply left to bleed out. Linke was also symbolic punishment. Families of those executed could lose property or social status. The practice continued for almost 1,000 years until it was abolished in 1905 during late Qing reforms. Today, it stands as one of history's most tormenting executions. 5. The rack. The rack is one of the most iconic torture devices of medieval Europe, commonly used by the Inquisition, royal courts, and prisons from the 13th century onward. Its exact origin is unclear, but it is believed to have been refined in England during the reign of Edward I, designed to tear the human body. Apart without immediate death, the rack consisted of a long wooden frame with rollers at both ends. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied to these rollers. And as interrogators turned the handles, the ropes tightened, pulling the body in opposite directions. The gradual stretching dislocated joints tore muscles and sometimes separated limbs entirely. The cracking of bones and snapping of ligaments often forced confessions from prisoners, whether true or false. Notably, the rack was used on conspirators, heretics, and spies. One famous victim was Guy Fawkes, tortured after the failed gunpowder plot of 1605. By then, his body was so damaged he could barely sign his name. The rack symbolized medieval justice at its harshest public, painful, and designed to break both body and spirit. Although outlawed in later centuries, its reputation remains one of the darkest chapters of European punishment. For scaphism, the boat scaphism, also known as the boats, is one of the most terrifying torture methods described in ancient sources, reportedly used by the Achaemenid Persians in the 5th century BCE. While some historians debate its frequency, the accounts are detailed enough to reveal a uniquely brutal form of death. The victim was placed between two hollowed wooden boats or inside a log split into two halves. Only the head, hands, and feet remained exposed. Torturers then force-fed the condemned large quantities of milk and honey until they vomited and suffered violent diarrhea. The mixture attracted insects, flies, ants, worms, and beetles which crawled inside the boats and burrowed into the victim's skin. More milk and honey were smeared over the body to ensure continuous infestation. The person slowly rotted alive as insects fed on open wounds and flesh. Death could take days or even weeks, caused by dehydration, infection, and the overwhelming internal decay. The most famous recorded case is Mithridates, a soldier punished for betraying King Artaxerxes II. His death reportedly lasted 17 days. Whether exaggerated or not, scaphism remains one of the most psychologically devastating methods ever recorded. 3. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, was used across Europe from the early Middle Ages until the 18th century. Originating around the 9th century, it was intended for criminals, considered especially dangerous murderers, robbers, and traitors. The goal was not just execution, but total destruction of the body. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, either upright or laid flat on the ground. Executioners used heavy iron bars to smash the limbs in a specific order designed to prolong suffering. Blows were aimed at the arms, legs, shins, and ribs, shattering bones without immediately harming vital organs. After the bones were broken, the twisted body was woven through the wheels, spokes, and displayed publicly as a warning. In some regions, a mercy blow to the chest or neck ended the suffering early. But in harsher cases, the condemned was left alive, exposed to the sun, animals, and dehydration. The execution of St. Catherine of Alexandria supposedly gave the wheel its famous name, though her story is partly legendary. By the 18th century, the wheel was outlawed, ending nearly a millennium of brutal public punishment. 2. Sawing in half. Sawing was a widespread execution method used in various cultures, from ancient Rome to medieval Europe and parts of the Middle East. Because it required little equipment, a simple saw and manpower, it became a common punishment for treason, adultery, murder, and religious crimes. Unlike dramatic devices such as the rack or Iron Maiden, sawing relied on human endurance and cruelty. One of the most notorious versions involved hanging the victim upside down. This position ensured that blood flowed to the head, keeping the person conscious longer. The executioners then began sawing between the legs and continued downward through the pelvis. Because gravity pulled the blood away from major organs, the victim often stayed alive until the saw reached the abdomen. Roman sources mention sawing as a punishment for Christian martyrs. In medieval Europe, it was used during inquisitions, while some Middle Eastern rulers employed it against political enemies. The method required multiple executioners who took turns due to exhaustion, highlighting the sheer physical brutality involved. Sawing was not only a form of death, but a statement of authority meant to terrify anyone who dared challenge the ruling powers of the time. 1. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden is perhaps the most famous torture device that never actually existed in the Middle Ages, though commonly believed to originate in medieval Germany. Historians now agree it was a 19th century fabrication, created for museum displays to sensationalize medieval brutality. The device was described as a human-shaped iron cabinet lined with sharp spikes on the inside. A victim would be placed inside, standing upright, and when the doors closed, the spikes would pierce the body without striking vital organs, causing slow, agonizing bleeding. The myth likely evolved from earlier devices like the chandamantel, a punishment cloak used for public humiliation, and execution methods involving spiked coffins. In 1793, curators in Nuremberg displayed a reconstructed Iron Maiden, claiming it had been used centuries earlier. The sensational attraction spread across Europe, cementing the device in pop culture despite its historical inaccuracy. Even though it wasn't a genuine medieval torture tool, the Iron Maiden symbolizes the fear and fascination surrounding Europe's dark past. It represents how myths can become accepted as history, shaping our understanding of ancient cruelty even when the truth is far more complicated and often even more horrifying.